Let me now get to the main part of the program, which is why we're all here, and that is to hear from our Attorney General, Mike Bowers. As is our custom, again, we have Mike's biographical sketch at your table, so I'm not going to repeat all the various accomplishments and things that he's done. My first involvement with Mike Bowers was when I was a fairly young staffer at the governor's office under Governor Busbee back in 1981, I guess it was, Mike. And at that time, Mike had just been chosen to replace longtime Attorney General Arthur Bolton as the Attorney General by Governor Busbee. And he was a real young guy, and he had skipped over a whole bunch of other more senior people in the law department, and which kind of caught my attention. I asked the governor, I said, what is it about Mike Bowers? He said, well, and Busbee was a lawyer, incidentally, but he said that Mike is one of the few lawyers that he knew who would give him straight answers, that wouldn't mince words or condition advice, that would give him right what he was looking for, which is a bottom line straight answer. And I think we've seen that ever since, that Mike's not a one to dance around tough issues. He takes them head on. He's one of the most principled people I've ever met, and I think he's a tremendous credit to the state. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you, and a lot of you know him already, but our friend Mike Bowers.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Griff, and I thank y'all for the warm reception. As I look around the room, I get the impression some of y'all are in the wrong place. The gubernatorial announcement is going to be a little bit later, somewhere else in this facility. And as I looked around and saw the lobbyists here, I thought, I believe they are in the wrong place. So if you are, you can leave. Nobody will say a thing, and I'll make sure it's not on camera. I appreciate the chance very much to be with y'all. I have always followed the theory of giving talks to talk about something that I know at least a little bit about and something about which I feel very strongly, and I will do that, and I want to talk to you about two subjects. One, my take, for whatever it's worth, not that I have any great insight on the elections that have just taken place. Number two, what's in the offing in terms of issues, significant debates that we're about to face. As to the elections, I thought before the elections there were 5 major contests out there, the outcome of which would tell us a lot about where we're going as a state in terms of politics. And those 5 elections were, number 1, of course, the presidential election. Number 2, the Senate election. 3, Secretary of State. 4, the congressional elections. And 5, what happened in the state houses, Senate and the House of Representatives. Now, I know in doing that I ignore a lot of elections like district attorneys and all of that sort of thing, but I thought from those 5 elections we could probably get a pretty good sense of what's going on. And now, with that having occurred, I think we have a pretty good sense. The bottom line for me is sort of simple. What I have felt for several years in that this state is undergoing the most significant political change since Reconstruction continues unabated, without any doubt. It's not going to change in the foreseeable future absent some major happening which simply cannot be foreseen. First of all, why do I say it's a major change? I want to use an example. There were a couple of folks in this room present, and I saw what I think, and I will share with you as an anecdote, is evidence of the kind of change that's taking place in Georgia. I was recently appointed to a foundation, and I'm most honored to serve on it. I went to my first meeting and I looked around the table, and assembled there were some extraordinarily successful, influential, and fine people. 5 to 10 years ago, you could have looked around that table and said, here is the future political leadership of this state. Not just political leadership, but leadership in a whole host of areas. And they all shared certain characteristics. Male, middle age, white, generally conservative, ties to the land, not necessarily raised on the farm or farmers, but they had ties to the rural areas of Georgia. An additional characteristic they shared was that each of them had been mentored by some significant Georgia political figure. And as I looked around the table, I realized in large measure these people have been moved off to the side in terms of what's happening in Georgia politics in a rather dramatic way. And they've been replaced. They've been replaced by people that we would not have foreseen 20 or 30 years ago. People who are conservative, they're both male and female, they're both black and white. A lot of them come from out of state, like Newt Gingrich, like Paul Coverdale, like John Linder, like Bob Barr, and I can go on and on, Bob Snelling in the House, and on and on. And this group of new people, not all of whom are out-of-staters, some of them are people who were born and raised here and who are or share the same characteristics as that group around that table. But it is a major, major change in the political makeup of the leadership of this state. And I think the elections substantiate that. Without considering the most recent elections, just go back 4 or 5 years with our congressional delegation. We had 10 people in Congress. We had 9 Democrats and 1 Republican. If you look at the 9 Democrats, you find that 8 of them pretty much shared the characteristics that I described of the people who sat around that table, almost to a person. We had 1 black representative, John Lewis, and we had 1 Republican, Newt Gingrich, who grew up out of state. Look at what has happened. Look at the change. Not one single representative sharing the characteristics of the people around that table remains in the United States congressional delegation from the state of Georgia. And that is a major, major change. All right, what about the elections? Let's look at them specifically. I thought that if the Democrats were to be able to say that there was some sort of revitalization of their party, they had to win 3 of the 5. They didn't. And I think the fact that they didn't is evidence that this change in Georgia politics will keep on going. Presidential race, despite all the predictions, despite predictions of 20% deficits, Bob Dole carried Georgia, and that is an absolute miraculous sort of thing. Senate race, the most popular politician, or one of 3, Sam, Zell, and Max, one of 3 of the most popular politicians in this state, had to have the rules changed to win, and then only won a plurality of about 30,000 votes. Now that tells you something, and he was running against an individual who 5 years ago was an absolute political unknown in this state, but someone who is representative of many of the people who are leading the change in politics today. He didn't even grow up here. The congressional race may be the most revealing of all. It's only been a couple of years ago that many of the leaders in the Democratic Party were saying, if we can just get these lines changed from what the Justice Department forced us to do, forcing a form of racial apartheid in the election process, if we can just get that changed and get it back like it ought to be, using some rational bases for congressional districting, things are going to go back just the way they are. I cannot tell you how many times I heard that. And do you know what happened? Not by virtue of any action the state of Georgia took, but by virtue of court action. That's precisely what happened. They got exactly what they wanted. Now, I don't mean to cast any aspersions on the court. By doing that, I'm going to defend that in the U.S. Supreme Court in a couple of weeks. I think the court did a real good job using traditional districting principles and all that sort of thing, trying to make sure it's not predominated by race. But nonetheless, the speaker and them got precisely what they wanted. And what was the result? Not one whit's difference. And that may be the second most significant thing that happened in this election. Their rules, what they wanted, and they got beat. And it's no change. Secretary of State's race, I concede. They won, very attractive young candidate. One of the persons, obviously, to whom the Democrats, Lewis, will have to look in the future for leadership. Just one election, though. And now, what I believe is the most significant race, the House and Senate. The Republicans gained 10%, a 10% increase in the number of representatives in the House. I don't care what your business or what your politics, that's a pretty good rate of return. It is a monstrous change. For the first time in the history of this state, Republicans will be the largest single group in the House and in the Senate with an increase of 1. Now that may not sound like much to you, but I predict to you that is going to be a monstrous change over time, and it is just a harbinger of what's coming in 1998 or 1990. And that is, for the first time, both the House and the Senate of the Georgia legislature will become Republican. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that we can all stand up and shout and all of a sudden everything's going to be okay? No, it does not. We as Republicans don't have some magic formula for good government, and how well we will do, or Republicans will do, will depend on, I think, two things. It will depend on, one, how well we reach out to minorities and women, and how inclusive we are without sacrificing principle. Most especially as to minorities, that is, for me, from my perspective, the single most significant issue which we face. And the kind of nation that Betty Rose and my grandsons will face probably depends on how well we handle that issue. And that's extraordinarily important to Republicans. We are viewed as being a bit exclusive. We must reach out. And I think the most compelling message in that regard is simply this, and it's right there in the Constitution. We will treat all human beings as creatures of God Almighty, special, based solely upon their merit. And that's how hard they work, what they contribute, and what their character is. That is a compelling message. I don't care where you live or what your politics are. And I had it reaffirmed for me 2 weeks ago as graphically as I possibly could have had reaffirmed when I went to Bosnia. I was over there on military duty. I spent election day in Bosnia, in Croatia, and I cannot describe to you the visible tragedy that has beset that part of the world because people are unwilling to treat one another and have their government treat them solely on the basis of merit and instead say, we want to be treated as members of groups, Muslims, Serbs, or Croatians. That's our great task. Now, what is the most significant specific issues out there? Hank asked me that this morning at breakfast. I think one looms over all else, and I've been talking about it for 10 years unsuccessfully, and I regret that, and that is my failing, and I don't blame a soul. The issue is crime, and make no mistake about it. If you survey the people of our state, there is nothing that ranks above that, and it must be dealt with. And it is far worse than you can imagine, and the biggest tragedy of all is, by golly, it can be dealt with, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what to do. Best source that I can cite to you in terms of a prescription for what to do is look at the report of the Council on Violent Crime issued last January. Judge Griffin Bell, William Bennett serve as the co-chairs. There's a host of luminaries that served on that committee, and they said three things, real simple. Number one, you got to prevent. Number two, you got to protect. And number three, you got to restrain. The prevention, that means doing something about children, not just throwing money at them, not just financing children, giving money to their parents as we have done for years, but something meaningful, giving them a sense of morality, a sense of future, a sense of decency. Number two, protect. More police. Enforce the laws. Don't let drunks sleep on the streets. I mean, it sounds petty, but ask New York, how did they make such a dramatic change? And then finally, restrain. Lock the bad guys up. Now that gets to a specific issue, and for the next 1 or 2 sessions of the General Assembly, I'll predict to you this will be one of the dominating issues. And some of the folks in the House, Republicans, have miraculously secured for the bill, House Bill 85. And you're going to hear that just the same way it was heard all over the campaign trail. And it's real simple. If you want murderers, burglars, robbers, folks who commit aggravated assault, sell dope, or assaultive sex offenses in our state to continue, note I say continue, to be released after serving about 35% of their sentence, then you want to oppose this bill. But if you want them locked up meaningfully for at least 85% of their sentence, you better get with it. And I'm going to make you a prediction. This bill's going to pass because the people want it so bad, and they're a whole lot smarter than we politicians are. They know something that many of us have just failed to recognize. We get right up to and say, well, there's got to be some sociological, psychological reason why this ain't so. And what the public knows, the politicians won't recognize, is this simple truth that is absolutely undebatable. Bad guys locked up cannot commit new crimes on the street. End of debate. I mean, this is really not rocket science. But you know that bill, so help me God, got voted on. And that vote, above all else, was the focus of the debate in the legislative races, especially the House races. You know what the vote was? 58 to 103. And all 58 were Republicans, and every Democrat that voted against it. 100 of 103 votes were Democratic. And if you think that didn't resound with the public out there, you don't know nothing about politics. That was the issue, and it will continue to be the issue, and it ought to be, because we've talked tough, but we haven't acted. Now, it's going to take some will. It's going to cost some money. The opponents say it'll cost a whole lot of money. It will cost a lot of money, depending on who you listen to, between $1 billion and $2.5 billion. I think $1 billion, other folks think $2.5 billion. It doesn't matter. It's still the best bargain in government. You know how much $1 billion is over 10 years? Let me tell you. Every year when the governor recommends a budget, he sends one over for me. And every year Tom and the boys cut my budget. Just sort of let me know they're still around and in control. And that's life. That's life. Last year, they cut me by $93,000, 0.007%, 0.007%. If you cut everybody in state government the same percentage for 10 years, you fund the lower end of that estimate, and government never misses a beat. Think about that. Now, if they'd cut us double, I'd have squealed and hollered, but we'd have kept on going. And if you cut everybody double that, you just about fund the upper end. So it's going to happen. That's going to be the focus of debate for a year or two here, and it is simply because the need is overwhelming. And I will close by telling you what that need is. I have cited these numbers. I have challenged the editorial board of the Atlanta paper to publish them, and they never have. They published a form of them, but they won't publish the numbers. And here's what they are. If you think crime isn't an issue, think about these numbers. 1960, my hometown, Atlanta, Georgia, 485,000 people, 67 murders, 44 rapes, 308 robberies. 34 years later, 1994, population has dropped in corporate limits 11%, or 15% to 411,000 people. Not 67 murders, 191. Not 44 rapes, 422. And listen to this, not 308 robberies, 5,343. I don't care what your politics are. I don't care whether you're rich, poor, liberal, conservative, black or white, it does not matter. One robbery for every 80 citizens of the city of Atlanta is outrageous. And if it were just Atlanta, I wouldn't sweat it so bad. Maybe we'd be doing something wrong. It's true all over this country. I can cite you the numbers. Go get them out of my briefcase for cities all over this country. The public has had it. I tell lawyers groups, any group that'll listen to me, if we don't address this, we are in for some rough times, and do not be deceived by these slightly dropping crime rates. It's the lull before the storm. Most crimes committed by young people. We got a hell of a lot more 5-year-olds today than 10 years ago. You better watch your goodies, Hawkeye. They're coming. The super predators. Young males, 15 to 30, who have never been told, I love you. Who have never been told there is a right and a wrong, and we better get with it and wise up, or this country will change in ways that we cannot imagine. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you very much. I'm obviously so bad, my wife's even leaving. What are your questions? Yes, sir.
Mike, are you going to run for governor?
I don't know. And I'll tell you why. I don't want to make a long answer out of that. Very flattering. I got elected to serve as Attorney General, and I'm going to do that for a while longer. And when I decide not to run for something else, I'm going to quit. I can't participate in running for governor with the attendant need to raise $7 or $8 million and be the state's chief legal officer. You don't want that. I couldn't do it. I just wouldn't feel comfortable. So when I decide, if I decide, I will quit and go at it hammer and tong. But thank you for the question. I didn't plant that, y'all, honest to God. John?
Mike, of course, me and most of the people are all in favor of the 85% sentence being served. However, the situation still remains that if you get one judge who, say, quote-unquote, soft on crime, gives a particular defendant a year, and somebody goes before a hard judge who commits the same crime and gets 5 years, 85% of that time still is a dramatically different sentence. The next step, it seems to me, to do what's been happening in the federal system, is to have a guideline system so that not only do people get to serve 85% of their time, but comparable offenders get comparable sentences. What do you think about that?
I agree. But I fully agree. But as you know, John, politics is more art than science. And if we can get 85%, that's a major accomplishment. The reason is, a lot of folks will say, well, we got 2 strikes. We do. We have 2 strikes, but it does not cover many of the crimes covered by the 85% bill, like dope dealing, which feeds most crime. It doesn't deal with burglary. All burglary is a murder and nobody was at home. Doesn't cover either one of those, plus it does not cover any crime that was committed on or before January the 1st, 1995, which is a whole bunch of the 35,000, 400 or 500 folks we got locked up this morning. What else? Richard?
Mike, a lot of Republican leaders over the past have talked about reaching out to minorities to bring them into the party. It's been a lot of talk and not a whole lot of concrete results. How do you propose to make that happen?
I don't have an answer for that, Richard, in terms of a special program. I continue to believe that the most compelling political message that exists on this earth today, and especially after going to Bosnia, is that we stand for the proposition that we will not tolerate discrimination based on race, and that we stand for the proposition that all men are created equal and will be treated as such. Now, let me boil that down to something you put out there talking to folks. And this is tough medicine. My barber, I've told many of y'all about. He is a political genius who never finished high school. And he put this as succinctly as I've ever heard it during the flag controversy. I went in to get a haircut one Friday, and he said, Mike, I'm going to tell you how to handle the flag situation, and you can be governor with it. And I said, well, Wendell, I'm all ears. This is what he said. He said, you know, we ought to change the flag because it's the Christian thing to do. Now, for those of you who are from the South, you know when a Southern Gentile tells you that, that's coming from the absolute depths of his heart. But he said it'll never work as long as there's Miss Black America. And that's where we are today. Now, what we've got to do is to be tough enough to stand up to folks who still want to discriminate, and folks that want to look down on people of color or not treat them right or talk about them ugly. Got to stand up to them, and that's sometimes kind of tough to do. And number two, we got to stand up to folks who say the only way this country is going to succeed is with set-asides and preferences and reparations and that sort of stuff. And you run the risk of being called soft on the one side and a racist on the other, but it is still the most compelling political message on the face of the earth today, I believe. And if we'll stand firm on that, absolutely hard, steadfast, we will succeed because it is the truth. Yes, ma'am.
It's been said that one way to handle the increased prison population is to privatize the prisons. How do you feel about that?
I'm for it. You can't really argue against that, but you have to be careful because the benefit of privatization depends on the deal you drive. It's just like everything else we contract for in Georgia in terms of services. I contract for several $1 million worth of legal services. I feel kind of proud that my folks, the ones that work with me, have been able to negotiate an average of $57 an hour. I mean, as John can tell you, that's cheap legal work. And privatization is the same way. It depends on how good a bargain we strike. But as a general proposition, it is a very good thing for us to do, and we ought to be looking at ways to get it done. One more. I don't want to keep y'all too late. Y'all got an announcement to go to. Anything else? Good. Have a wonderful holiday season. God bless you. Thanks.